I'm going to invite Shen Narayanasamy up to the stage. Sorry, I've been practicing that. And so come on up, Shen. Shen's just going to set up her presentation, and while she does that, I just wanted to point out that James and his colleague here, Farah, have brought some leaflets for us, and they're just over the table there. So feel free to have a look through those as you go for your lunch, and also to chat to both of them as well. So Farah here in the right, and of course James is available. How are you going?
Thank you. USB.
Great.
I'm sorry. Do you know what? I've forgotten how to use Microsoft.
I know, you work at an Apple too.
No, but I was always against Apple, but now I'm just totally... I've best sold out in a year. That's all it took.
Which one?
Maybe the Shen. Yeah. How about that? Thank you. Maybe the PDF? Is that the easiest? And we'll do full screen. How about thank you, Shen?
Okay, let's welcome Shen.
Yep, no worries. View, zoom, full, actual zoom to page. Full screen. Oh, full screen mode. There we go. We're getting there. Sorry, folks. So, yes, my name is Shen. I'm the Human Rights Campaign Director at Get Up, and I was the Executive Director of No Business and Abuse until that actually became a part of Get Up as well. I thought it might be useful, can you all hear? Is this okay? I thought it might be useful, and thanks so much, James, to zoom down a little bit from the broad perspective of overall ethical investment and questions of ethics, morals and values in the market, to give you a bit of an explanation about how we developed a campaign that sought to use that language to get an outcome in the corporate space. So both Bryn and I have actually been intimately involved in No Business and Abuse, and when we were talking through this, what we thought might be useful would be if I actually gave you a bit of an outline of how we developed the campaign and how we utilised the language and tools available in corporate ethical responsibility, social responsibility, accountability space, and married that with campaigning to produce the outcome we wanted. And what Bryn will talk about is a little bit more about what language we used and how that actually took place in terms of the interactions between campaigning and target funds or investors or banks, etc. So the NBIA campaign, I'm not sure how many people have a vague understanding of No Business and Abuse. A few people around the place. So I'll try and skip over a little bit of it. Hang on. There we go. So I've actually put up here a bit of a really nerdy explanation about No Business and Abuse. But I think it's probably useful to think about it, and this is literally the planning documents we used, to think about it from the perspective of what we were trying to do. So if you go back nearly 2 years to when we started No Business and Abuse, what we had was a situation in which the Australian government had enacted an offshore detention and deterrence regime that was almost unquestionably in violation of international law, and pretty grave violations of international law. So contravening basic rights around liberty, liberty of children, torture and trauma, grave violations, things that were irremediable, so people had died, people had been raped and sexually assaulted, you know, really serious violations of international law. And it was pretty unequivocal when you looked at the evidence. Yet in that system, we had, at the time at which we started No Business in Abuse, we had a number of quite well-respected international corporations that were involved in providing essential services to that regime. And not only that, in March of the year that we started, which was last year, the government had opened a tender process for a 5-year corporate contract to run the detention centres. And there had been around 15 tenders from a variety of different multinational companies for those contracts. So what you have there at the beginning of the regime was essentially a failure of existing frameworks around ethical investment and, you know, the UN Global Compact and a whole host of voluntary regimes and agreements amongst the corporate world and financiers, etc., that they had basically failed to prevent a situation of corporate involvement and complicity in gross violations. And not only that, the revenue that the companies were able to obtain as a result of these contracts was astounding. So we started from the position as refugee advocates and activists of saying our aim is to eliminate respectable private sector involvement in our mandatory detention regime. So our aim wasn't to change the entire sector. Our aim wasn't completely focused on, changing the practices of a financier or a bank. Our aim was we need to end respectable private sector involvement in this regime. So we went through two main objectives once we started with that aim. And the first was to evaporate the actual appetite of all of these actors to associate with the mandatory detention regime. So not only the companies that successfully took the contracts, which at that time was Transfield, as they were known, but also all 15 of the tenderers for a 5-year contract for the regime, the detention regime. We wanted to impact the broad appetite for respectable private sector operators to get involved or anywhere near association with this regime. The second objective was to create a conflicting set of interests between the government on one hand and the corporates on the other. So prior to our involvement, there'd obviously been a joining of interests in this situation. There was a large amount of money changed hands. The government contracted the private sector corporations to basically run this regime. And interestingly, they were really essential to the regime because if you know anything about the situation, you know that what the government often says about the offshore detention centres of Manus and Nauru is that they hold no responsibility for what happens there because they're in those countries. And they do that by paying large amounts of money to a private sector operator to run the thing. So there was an obvious joining of interests there, which is unusual when you think about it, because you've got contractor and contractee. And one of our major objectives, our second major objectives, was to try and break that and create conflicts of interest there, all to lead to this plan to try and eliminate respectable private sector involvement. So we did 4 things. We had 4 major strategies, and I'll go to the bottom objective in a moment. The first strategy around evaporating the appetite really looked at stigmatising the provision of services. It's really interesting, this stigmatising, because we often think about it as just flow of money. And flow of money is all that impacts a company and what it does. And what we forget is that companies are full of people. They're full of workers, people have pride in what they do, they're full of people who sit on other boards. Company directors often sit on a range of boards. One of the directors of Transfield was on the board of UN Women. They go out to parties, they want to be seen as respectable individuals. So we created a key strategy around stigma, the creation of cultural stigma around association with detention, and pointed it towards the investors, financiers and the corporations involved. The second thing that we did is we wanted to incentivise disengagement. So we wanted to create, knowing that companies often operate in a world of profit and loss and cost-benefit analysis, we wanted to weight that cost-benefit analysis to incentivise disengagement and incentivise good behaviour for companies who would publicly say we will not associate. So those stigmatise and incentivise were the 2 strategies that we took forward in relation to Objective 1, trying to evaporate the private sector appetite. And I'll go through later what the actual activities we did in relation to those strategies. The last 2 was to create fractures between the federal government and the Department of Immigration and the companies. So that was a really interesting kind of approach. So when I say creating fractures, think of it like this. What would happen in the offshore detention centres when we started was a UN Special Rapporteur or the Red Cross or Amnesty International would attempt to get into the centres. And they would contact the companies and they would contact the governments, and everyone would pass the buck, and eventually all questions went back to the Department of Immigration in Australia. And the same thing happened with media inquiries. So media inquiries would go to Transfield about particular aspects of their behaviour. Remember one particular story, Julian Burnside, the well-known refugee barrister, had tried to organise a letter writing activity from Australians to people in detention. And Transfield, at the time in charge of the detention centres, had refused to accept those letters and refused to pass them out. But when The Guardian rang Transfield for comment, they just passed it on to the Department of Immigration. So there was a very comfortable joining of interests there which protected both parties. And what we wanted to do was to try and name and shame the companies and create conflicting interests between the federal government and those companies to try and break apart the comfort of that relationship. The last thing that we would try to do is specifically target companies in multilateral fora. So it was around a global naming and shaming. Now, we had seen for many, many years attempts by lawyers and activists to globally talk about Australia in this context, to go to the UN and embarrass the country and to go elsewhere and write reports and release them internationally. But there had been very little attempt to do so to the companies. And ironically, these companies were multinational actors with operations across the world, and if anything, were far more vulnerable than the Australian government. So it was a specific strategy of building a multilateral, multinational campaign around these companies. So the next thing that we did when we thought about this, and I think this is really important when we talk about divestment, because what we did, our aim was to stop the respectable private sector involvement, as we said earlier. So we're not actually aiming per se for divestment or aiming per se for any one particular outcome. We're aiming for one particular tool. Our aim is to eliminate this involvement. So what we sat down and did is we thought about the business, and there you have Transfield. We thought about the business and all of their touchstone points. And we realised, obviously, there's investors. You know, industry super was a major target, ethical funds, church-based funds, other targets. Overseas, the Norwegian Pension Fund was an investor, and global banks. So now, divestment to a large degree constrains your view just to the top right-hand corner of the screen there. But what it forgets is the other side is the client sectors, is the notion that businesses all inhabit a social context where they have clients of some kind or another. And the clients in these situations for many of these companies were hospitals, universities, schools, local councils, local government and providers of essential services like water and providers of public transport. So that was an equally important focus of the campaign. The bottom one was again referencing that strategy and objective around stigma, was around cultural capital. Really, really important, cultural and brand capital for any corporation. And it's really important in the sense that that's why companies sponsor things like the Museum of Contemporary Art. It's why Transfield was the sponsor of the Sydney Biennale, the big art festival in Sydney that's held on a 2-yearly basis. And it's why directors sit on, UN Women and the St James Ethics Centre, etc. And finally, on the bottom side was a little bit more on financiers. So what we wanted to do when we mapped all of this out really is when you're looking with the strategic aim that we were, looking at the strategies we have, you have a really broad base there. The second question we ask is, who are the people that NBIA and activists have contacts with in all those areas? And obviously people go to super members and go to ethical and responsible investment people inside banks and funds, people like James and others. But if you go then over to the other side, you see doctors and nurses, professors and uni students, teachers, parents, kids, councillors, state government. And when you do that from the perspective of a campaign like No Business and Abuse on the issue of refugees, what we do know there is that 25%, broadly speaking, of the public in Australia have always been with us on the topic of refugees. And the spread of public opinion goes according to income and education. So right there, doctors and nurses, professors and uni students, teachers, parents and kids, councillors, state government, and even people inside the investors and ethical investment world, they're the people we already have. So what you start to see here, and if you look down the bottom, artists, the Twitter sphere, the liberal elite, these are our people. And what you see there, and what we realised at this point, is that our people are highly connected into the sectors we need to activate and are highly critical to engaging the strategy we'd outlined earlier. The problem you have at this point in time, though, is traditionally, and given both Bryn and my background and others involved in no business and abuse, a lot of us had been corporate campaigning for a while now. So I had a 5-year background as the lead for economic justice in Oxfam Australia, doing this kind of work. And what often happens at this stage is the movement and the issue fragments. People you start talking divestment to investors, you start talking, bank codes of conduct and bank ethical investment parameters to banks. You have something else in relation to the cultural section and something else in relation to teachers and parents. And what we wanted when we saw all of this is, don't forget, we want to eliminate private sector involvement across the board. And we have this strategy that's supposed to create stigma, that's supposed to incentivise involvement, that's supposed to stigmatise and build, etc. So what we wanted here was something that would unify everybody together. So what we used was we translated the basic tenets of ethical investment, the basic tenets of international law, and the values of these groups of people into 4 really clearly understood notions, which explained why mandatory detention and offshore detention was unlawful. And it was considered, and we framed it as a pledge, and a pledge about values. And the first value was that we will not impinge, that we will take a zero tolerance approach, to child abuse. So we had an NBIA pledge, which talked about first principle, zero tolerance to child abuse. Second principle was in relation to holding people in contravention of their liberty and their right to freedom. Third principle was not engaging in torture and unlawful degrading treatment. And the fourth was in relation to transparency. So what we did with those, they seem really easy. I mean, we started from the premise of who is not going to sign a pledge that says we have zero tolerance to child abuse? I mean, what are you going to argue? Oh, actually, I think child abuse in certain circumstances is perfectly fine. And so what we did with that was just draw down and translate all of those notions from all of these different sectors into one pledge. And our idea was this one pledge can be adopted by banks, it can be adopted by investors, it can be adopted by schools, universities, local councils, artists, everybody across the planet. And what we would do would be drive adherence to this pledge of basic values, and in doing so, slowly roll out this campaign that would require people who had adhered to the pledge or indicated the pledge had been in accordance with their values to step back from and or criticise people who could not sign that pledge or were engaged in activities that contravened it. So we went, local councils, at this point 9 local councils across the country have signed up to it. Many of the super funds felt like this pledge was perfectly reasonable values that were already reflected in all of the different things they had set out, perfectly in accordance with ethical investment criteria, etc., etc. And we rolled it out across the country and across the globe. So that, I think, I hope that gives you an understanding from the viewpoint of a practitioner of how you utilise all of these things to bring it together in terms of an overall campaign. So I think it's useful at this point, just to close, to go back to, okay, then what are the activities and specific outcomes we got to in relation to this strategy? So in terms of our aim, we are now in a situation where there is no available tenderers for the offshore detention centres. Those 15 have disappeared. The Department of Immigration has indicated that no one is willing to tender. And the one company that was left holding the baby and the bathwater, really, which was Transfield, but Transfield, after it changed its name to Broad Spectrum to avoid the cultural stigmatisation that occurred with Transfield, and then its share price plummeted as, a number of different investors, both quietly and publicly, divested from their funds. You can see the share price plummeting, and at that point became a target for an international takeover. And then at the point of the international takeover, the company, a Spanish company, Ferrovial, announced it was walking away from half of the underlying revenue of Transfield, now Broad Spectrum, and withdrawing from offshore detention. So right now, at this point in time, there seems to be no respectable private sector actor willing to put up its hand and take that contract from October next year. So I think that's nice. it's not over, but I think in terms of, if you can conceive of it now in terms of that point, that's where we got to. And in terms of all of the different objectives, I think what we've seen now is incredible stigma associated with detention providers and services. And the interesting thing now is the competition to sign up to the pledge. You know, the way in which banks and councils and others are like, oh, we would like to sign up to it because it means that hospitals take it seriously when we go and contract with them. It means that other governments are looking at this as a key criteria, etc., etc., etc. The other really interesting thing was the way this fractured the relationship between the government. And the most telling example of this was when Ferrovial, the international company, said, without telling the government, that it wanted to exit the contracts in March of this year. And over their stated objections, the government basically exercised its right under the contract to force it to extend its services until October. So what we have now is this really interesting space where you've got an uncomfortable company, not quite lockstep with the government, and there's an enormous space in there to exploit, to try and take down the whole regime, which is nice. Thanks.
I just forgot objective 3.
Thanks very much, Shen. That was amazing. I love the spontaneous round of applause.
No.
It's nice to have a good news story in this field.